This is my true story. At 81 years old, I was living peacefully in my house with my 3 adult children and their families, thinking I'd found happiness in my final years, surrounded by grandchildren. Then they called a family meeting and told me I needed to move to a care facility because the house was too crowded and I wasn't contributing anything financially. They gave me 2 hours to pack 1 suitcase and then walked me to the curb and locked the door behind me. They left me sitting on the street in the cold with nowhere to go. But hours later, police discovered something that shocked my entire family. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. At 81 years old, I was living in what I thought was a comfortable, peaceful arrangement with my 3 adult children and their families, all under one roof in the large house I'd bought 40 years ago when my wife was still alive. The house had 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, which was enough space for everyone, even though it got crowded sometimes with all the grandchildren running around. I thought I'd found the perfect way to spend my final years surrounded by family and love and the sound of children playing. I helped with the grandkids when I could. I did small tasks around the house like watering plants and sorting mail. I stayed out of everyone's way as much as possible because I knew having an elderly parent living with you could be challenging. Then last Tuesday afternoon, my oldest son came to my room and asked me to come downstairs for a family meeting. I asked what it was about, and he said they just needed to discuss some household things and it would only take a few minutes. I followed him down to the dining room, where I found all 3 of my children sitting around the table with their spouses. 6 adults all looking at me with expressions that immediately told me something terrible was about to happen. The atmosphere in the room was tense and uncomfortable. Nobody was making eye contact with me. My daughter was fidgeting with her hands. My youngest son was staring at the table. Their spouses looked guilty and nervous. I sat down in the chair they'd left empty for me at the head of the table and waited for someone to explain what this meeting was about. My oldest son cleared his throat and started speaking in a rehearsed voice like he'd practiced these words multiple times before saying them. "Dad, we've been talking amongst ourselves for the past few weeks about the living situation here in the house. We all love you and appreciate everything you've done for us over the years. But honestly, this arrangement isn't working anymore for any of us. The house is just too crowded with all of us living here together. There's not enough space. There's not enough privacy. The kids are getting older and need their own rooms." I started to say something about how we could rearrange the bedrooms or convert the basement, but my son held up his hand to stop me. "We've already thought about all the options, Dad, and none of them really solve the problem. So we've made a decision that we think is best for everyone involved. We think it's time for you to move to a senior care facility where you can get proper attention and be around other people your age. There are some really nice places nearby that have activities and meal plans and medical staff on site. You'd probably be happier there anyway, instead of being stuck here in a crowded house with a bunch of busy families." I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I stared at my 3 children in complete disbelief, trying to process what I was hearing. They wanted to put me in a nursing home. They wanted me out of the house. They'd called this family meeting specifically to tell me I was being kicked out. "This is my home," I said quietly. "I've lived here for 40 years. Your mother and I raised you in this house. I don't want to go to some facility. I want to stay here with my family." My daughter spoke up for the first time with a cold edge to her voice. "Dad, this house belongs to all of us now. Mom is gone, and you can't take care of it by yourself. We're the ones maintaining it and paying for everything. You need to accept that it's time to move on." Before I could even begin to protest or defend myself or explain why this was completely unfair, they started piling on with what sounded like rehearsed complaints they'd been collecting and discussing behind my back for weeks or maybe months. My oldest son said I was too difficult to live with and that my routines disrupted everyone else's schedules. My daughter complained that the smell of my medications bothered her children and made the upstairs hallway unpleasant. My youngest son said I took too long in the bathroom every morning and it made everyone late for work and school because we only had 1 bathroom on the 2nd floor where most of the bedrooms were located. They went around the table taking turns listing grievances like they'd prepared a case against me in court. I was apparently always underfoot when they were trying to parent their children. I gave unwanted advice about how they were raising the grandkids. I watched television too loud in the evenings. I left dishes in the sink sometimes, instead of loading the dishwasher immediately. I asked too many questions about their lives and made them feel like they had no privacy. I complained about being cold and wanted the heat turned up higher than everyone else, which raised the utility bills. Every minor normal thing that comes with having an elderly person living in your house was being used as ammunition to justify throwing me out. Then my daughter said something that cut deeper than any of the other complaints. She looked at me with cold eyes and said without any emotion in her voice that I didn't contribute anything financially to the household anymore. "We're all supporting you, Dad, and frankly it's not fair to our kids. We're paying for your food and your utilities and your medications and the roof over your head. You're living here completely free while the rest of us are working hard and paying all the bills. Our children are going without things they need because we're taking care of you. That's not sustainable anymore. You need to go somewhere that's set up to care for elderly people who can't support themselves." The lies came so easily out of her mouth that I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wanted to interrupt and correct her right there, but I was too shocked to form words. The truth was, I had been paying the property taxes on this house every single year since I bought it 40 years ago. I paid them out of my pension and my savings. The property tax bill for this large house in a good neighborhood was over $15,000 annually. I also paid the utility bills, including electricity and gas and water, which added up to several $100s every month. I'd paid for major repairs over the past few years, including a new roof that cost $22,000 and a new furnace that cost $8,000. But somehow my children had convinced themselves that they were supporting me instead of the other way around. They'd apparently been telling each other this story for so long that they actually believed it. They thought I was a financial burden living in their house, eating their food, using their electricity, when the reality was completely opposite. I was subsidizing their lives by paying the major expenses that they couldn't afford on their own. Without my pension money covering property taxes and utilities, they probably couldn't afford to live in this house at all. But they'd constructed this narrative where I was the freeloader and they were the generous children taking care of their helpless father. My oldest son added that they'd all agreed it would be better for everyone if I moved to a facility where professionals could take care of me properly. He said they weren't equipped to handle an elderly parent's needs, and it wasn't fair to expect them to sacrifice their own family's well-being for mine. The whole conversation was clearly planned and rehearsed. They'd made their decision before this meeting even started. This wasn't a discussion. This was them informing me that I was being removed from my home whether I liked it or not. When I tried to argue with them and explain that this was my house and I had every right to stay here, my youngest son suddenly stood up from his chair with an impatient expression on his face. "We don't have time for a long discussion about this, Dad. We've already made the decision and we've already found you a place at a care facility that has availability. You need to go upstairs right now and pack your things. We're doing this today." I stared at him in complete shock, unable to process what he was saying. They weren't giving me time to think about this, or make other arrangements, or even say goodbye properly. They wanted me out immediately, like I was some kind of unwanted tenant they were evicting. I asked how much time I had to pack my belongings and find somewhere to go, and my daughter said 2 hours. 2 hours to pack up a lifetime of possessions and leave the house I'd lived in for 40 years. I stood up from the table feeling dizzy and unsteady on my feet. My hands were shaking as I walked up the stairs to my bedroom. I could hear them talking in low voices behind me, probably discussing how well their intervention had gone. I went to my room and stood there looking around at my things, not even knowing where to start. How do you pack 40 years of memories into suitcases in 2 hours? I grabbed one large suitcase from my closet and started throwing in clothes randomly. Some shirts and pants and underwear and socks. My medications from the bathroom. Some personal items like photos of my late wife and important documents I kept in my desk drawer. I was moving in a daze, not really thinking clearly, just grabbing whatever seemed essential. The 2 hours passed in a blur. I kept hoping one of my children would come upstairs and say they'd changed their minds or made a mistake. But nobody came to check on me. Nobody offered to help me pack. Nobody seemed to care that they were destroying their father's life. When the 2 hours were up, my oldest son appeared at my bedroom door and said it was time to go. I picked up my suitcase, which felt impossibly heavy, and followed him down the stairs. All 3 of my children and their spouses were waiting by the front door. Nobody was crying. Nobody looked particularly upset or guilty about what they were doing. They just wanted this over with so they could get back to their normal lives without the burden of an elderly father taking up space in their house. My daughter opened the front door, and they literally walked me outside to the curb like I was garbage being taken out for collection. I stood on the sidewalk in front of my own house, holding my suitcase and looking back at the home I'd lived in for 4 decades. The home where I'd raised these 3 ungrateful children. The home where my wife had died 5 years ago. The home where I'd planned to spend my final years surrounded by family. "Someone from the care facility will be here to pick you up soon," my daughter said, without even looking me in the eyes. She couldn't meet my gaze because somewhere deep down she knew what they were doing was wrong. But she did it anyway. Then they turned around and walked back into my house. I heard the door close behind them. I heard the lock click into place. They had just locked me out of my own home. I stood there on the curb at 81 years old with one suitcase containing everything I now owned in the world and nowhere to go. Neighbors were peeking out their windows watching this scene unfold. Cars drove past and people stared at the old man standing alone on the sidewalk. I felt humiliation and betrayal and shock all mixed together until I couldn't even think straight. My own children had thrown me out like I was nothing. I sat down on the curb next to my suitcase because my legs couldn't support me anymore, and I needed to think about what to do next. The sun was starting to go down, and the temperature was dropping as evening approached. I'd been told someone from the care facility would pick me up, but as minutes turned into an hour, and then 2 hours, nobody came. I pulled out my phone and tried calling the number my daughter had given me for the facility, but it went straight to a generic voicemail that didn't sound like any professional care home I'd ever heard of. That's when I realized they'd probably lied about arranging a place for me. They just wanted me gone and had made up the story about a facility to make themselves feel better about throwing me out. I tried calling my oldest son's cell phone to ask what was happening and when someone was coming to get me. The call went straight to voicemail without even ringing, which meant he'd blocked my number. I tried calling my daughter and got the same result. Then I tried my youngest son, and his phone did the same thing. All 3 of my children had blocked my number immediately after putting me out on the street. They didn't want to hear from me or deal with any questions or complaints I might have. They wanted me gone from their lives completely, and they'd taken the cowardly step of blocking me so they wouldn't have to face what they'd done. As evening turned into night, the temperature continued dropping, and I started shivering in my light jacket that wasn't warm enough for sitting outside for hours. I could see lights on inside my house through the windows. I could see shadows moving around as my children and grandchildren went about their evening routines, making dinner, watching television, getting ready for bed, living their comfortable lives in my house while I sat on the curb freezing. Several neighbors walked past me on their evening walks or coming home from work. These were people who'd known me for decades, people I'd waved to and chatted with over the years. But every single one of them averted their eyes when they saw me sitting there and hurried past without offering help or even asking if I was okay. I realized they probably assumed this was some kind of family dispute they didn't want to get involved in. Or maybe they thought I'd done something to deserve being thrown out and didn't want to interfere. Whatever their reasons, nobody stopped to help an 81-year-old man sitting on a curb in the cold with a suitcase. I thought about trying to walk somewhere, but I had no idea where to go. I didn't have enough money for a hotel. I didn't have any other family nearby who could take me in. My few remaining friends were elderly like me and living in assisted facilities or with their own children and couldn't help. As the hours passed and it got darker and colder, I realized I couldn't sit on this curb all night, or I might actually freeze to death. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and I was already shivering uncontrollably. My joints were aching from sitting in one position for so long. My bladder was uncomfortably full, but there was nowhere to go to the bathroom. I felt more helpless and abandoned than I'd ever felt in my entire 81 years of life. My own children had done this to me. The people I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for had thrown me away like garbage. Finally, I stood up with great difficulty, because my legs had gone stiff from sitting so long in the cold. I picked up my suitcase and started walking down the sidewalk with no destination in mind. I just knew I couldn't stay on that curb anymore. I walked slowly because my legs hurt and my back hurt, and I was exhausted emotionally and physically. I had no plan, no idea where I was going. I just walked into the cold, dark night with everything I owned in one suitcase. Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 houses down from me, had apparently been watching this entire situation unfold from her living room window with growing concern and alarm. She was a kind woman in her 60s, who I'd known for probably 20 years since she and her husband moved into the neighborhood. We'd always exchanged pleasantries when we saw each other, and she'd brought me meals occasionally after my wife died, knowing I was alone and probably not eating properly. She'd been home all afternoon and had witnessed my children walking me out to the curb with my suitcase. She'd watched me sit there for over 3 hours as the sun went down and the temperature dropped. She'd seen my children ignore me inside the house with all the lights on while I sat outside in the cold. When she saw me finally stand up and start walking aimlessly down the street with my suitcase in the dark, she knew something was very wrong with this situation. She didn't know all the details about what had happened or why my children had put me out, but she knew an 81-year-old man wandering the streets at night in the cold was dangerous and potentially life-threatening. She immediately picked up her phone and called the police to request a welfare check. She explained to the dispatcher that there was an elderly man from her neighborhood who appeared disoriented and confused, wandering the streets with a suitcase. She said she'd watched his family put him out of his home hours earlier, and he'd been sitting on the curb ever since with nowhere to go. She told the dispatcher she was genuinely worried he would freeze to death in the cold, or get hurt, or have a medical emergency while wandering around lost. She emphasized that he seemed vulnerable and in need of immediate help. The dispatcher took her report seriously and said they'd send officers to check on me right away. Mrs. Chen stayed on the line, giving them my description and the direction I'd been walking when she last saw me. She told them I was wearing a light jacket and carrying a brown suitcase and moving very slowly, like my body hurt. She wanted to make sure the police could find me quickly before something terrible happened. Officers were dispatched to the area within minutes of Mrs. Chen's call. They drove around the neighborhood searching for an elderly man matching my description. They found me about 6 blocks from my house, walking slowly along the sidewalk in the dark, still carrying my suitcase and looking completely lost. One of the officers pulled the patrol car alongside me and rolled down the window, asking if I was okay and if I needed help. I stopped walking and just stared at them, unable to form words, because I was so cold and exhausted and emotionally devastated. The officer got out of the car and approached me gently, asking my name and what was happening. I tried to explain that my children had thrown me out of my house, but the words came out confused and disjointed because I was shivering so hard I could barely speak. The officer could see I was in distress and potentially in danger from the cold. He helped me into the back of the patrol car where it was warm and got my suitcase secured. His partner called for another unit to assist, and they decided to bring me to the police station for my safety while they investigated what had happened. They said they couldn't just leave me wandering the streets in this condition, and they needed to understand the full situation before deciding how to help me. The drive to the police station took maybe 10 minutes. I sat in the back of that patrol car with the heater running, finally warming up after hours in the cold. I was still shivering, but starting to feel sensation returning to my fingers and toes. The officers were kind and professional, treating me with respect and concern. They kept reassuring me that everything would be okay, and they were going to figure out what happened and make sure I was safe. At the police station, the officers brought me into a quiet room and got me some hot coffee and a blanket to help me warm up from being outside in the cold for so many hours. They asked me to explain what had happened starting from the beginning so they could understand the full situation. I told them about the family meeting where my 3 children had informed me I needed to leave. I told them about being given 2 hours to pack. I told them about being walked to the curb and locked out of the house. I told them my children had blocked my number and left me sitting outside for hours claiming someone from a care facility would pick me up, but nobody ever came. The officers listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about the timeline and who was involved. One of the officers asked for the address of the house I'd been removed from so they could document everything properly. I gave them the address where I'd lived for 40 years. A detective who'd been listening to my story from across the room decided to run a routine property records check on that address to get more information about the situation. He went to his computer and pulled up the county assessor's database that shows ownership information for every property in the jurisdiction. He typed in my address and waited for the records to load. What came back on his screen made him stop and stare for a long moment before calling over the other officers. The property record showed that the house was titled solely in my name and had been since I purchased it in 1985. There were no other names on the title. No joint ownership with my children, no transfer of deed after my wife passed away, just my name as the sole legal owner of that property for the past 40 years. The assessed value showed it was worth approximately $600,000. The tax records showed I'd been paying the annual property taxes consistently every single year, without fail. The detective looked at me with a very different expression than he'd had a few minutes earlier. "Sir," he said carefully, "do your children know that you own that house? Does anyone besides you have their name on the property title?" I shook my head slowly as the full reality of the situation started dawning on me. My children had thrown me out of my own house. They'd forcibly removed the legal property owner from his own home and locked him out. They'd apparently assumed after my wife died 5 years ago that the house somehow automatically became theirs, or that it was jointly owned by all of us. But legally, it was mine, and mine alone. The officers gathered around the detective's computer screen looking at the property records and discussing the legal implications of what had just happened. One of them said this changed everything about how they needed to handle the situation. This wasn't just a family dispute about living arrangements anymore. This was potentially elder abuse and illegal eviction and possibly even theft, since my children had been living in my house without my permission after forcing me out. Another officer pointed out that I could press criminal charges if I wanted to, and my children could face serious legal consequences for what they'd done. The lead detective turned back to me and explained what they'd found. He said my children had just committed several crimes by forcibly evicting me from property I legally owned. He asked if I wanted to go back to my house right now with police escort or if I wanted to stay somewhere else for the night while I figured out what to do. I told them I wanted to go back immediately. That was my house. I'd lived there for 40 years. My children had no right to lock me out regardless of what they thought about the living arrangements. The detective nodded and said they'd drive me back there right now and make sure I got back inside safely. 2 police officers drove me back to my house at around 11 o'clock that night with copies of the property deed they'd printed from the county records database. I sat in the back seat of the patrol car, feeling a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite process. Relief that I wasn't going to be homeless on the streets. Anger at my children for what they'd done to me. Anxiety about what was about to happen when the police knocked on my door. The officers had explained on the drive over that they were going to make my children let me back inside immediately and that my children could face criminal charges for elder abuse and illegal eviction if I chose to pursue that route. We pulled up in front of my house and I could see lights still on inside, which meant my children were still awake. The officers helped me out of the car and retrieved my suitcase from the trunk. Then all 3 of us walked up to the front door of my own house where I'd been locked out just hours earlier. One of the officers knocked firmly on the door several times. We waited maybe 30 seconds before I heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened and my oldest son stood there looking confused and then immediately annoyed when he saw me standing there with police officers. "What's going on?" my son asked with irritation in his voice, like I was causing problems by showing up at his house with police. The lead officer stepped forward and spoke in a firm, authoritative voice that left no room for argument. "Your father owns this house. We've confirmed it through property records at the county assessor's office. He is the sole legal owner and has been for 40 years. You just illegally evicted him from his own property. You have 2 choices right now. You can let him back inside immediately, or we will arrest all 3 of you and your spouses for elder abuse and illegal eviction of a property owner. Those are felony charges. What's it going to be?" I watched my son's face drain of all color as the officer's words sank in. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out for several seconds. He looked at me standing there with the police and the property deed in the officer's hand, showing my name as sole owner. "That's not possible," he finally stammered. "This house belongs to all of us. Mom and Dad bought it together. When Mom died, it became ours too. He can't just own it by himself." The officer shook his head and held up the deed. According to legal property records, your father is the only name on this title. Your mother's name was never on it, just his. And there's been no transfer of ownership. This is his house, not yours. The officer then raised his voice slightly and said he needed all the adults in the house to come to the living room right now. My son stepped back from the door, looking shell-shocked, and called out for his siblings and their spouses. Within a minute, all 6 adults were gathered in my living room, looking confused and worried about why police were in their house at 11 at night. The officers didn't waste time with pleasantries. They explained that they'd been called to do a welfare check on an elderly man who'd been found wandering the streets. That elderly man was me, and when they ran a property check, they discovered I was the legal owner of this house. My daughter tried to interrupt, saying there must be some mistake, but the officer cut her off and told her to be quiet and listen. He explained that what they'd done to me constituted elder abuse under state law. That forcing an elderly person out of their home, especially their own property, was a serious crime. That they could all be arrested right now and charged with multiple felonies. My youngest son started to say something about how they didn't know I owned the house, but the officer told him ignorance wasn't a legal defense for committing crimes. The police made all 3 of my children and their spouses sit down in the living room while they explained the full legal situation and the serious trouble everyone was in. The lead officer stood in the center of the room holding the property deed and speaking in a tone that made it clear he was disgusted by what had happened here. He explained that I was the sole legal owner of this property and had been since purchasing it in 1985. He said there was no joint ownership with my children, no automatic transfer when my wife died, no legal claim any of them had to this house whatsoever. They had been living in my home apparently without even knowing it wasn't theirs. Then the officer addressed the claim my daughter had made during the family meeting about me not contributing anything financially. He pulled out copies of my bank statements that I'd given permission for the police to access as evidence. The statements showed $47,000 in payments I'd made over just the past 2 years alone. $15,000 per year in property taxes, several thousand in utility bills for electricity and gas and water, $22,000 for a new roof, $8,000 for a new furnace, hundreds of dollars in various repairs and maintenance costs. Every single major expense for this house had been paid by me from my pension and savings. My daughter's face went pale as the officer read out the numbers. She tried to argue, saying that couldn't be right because they'd been paying the bills. The officer asked her to show proof of any payments she'd made toward property taxes or major repairs. She couldn't produce anything because she hadn't paid for those things. I had. The officer then asked my oldest son if he'd been paying rent to live in this house. My son said no, of course not, because it was the family home. The officer nodded and said, exactly, that's the problem. You've been living rent-free in your father's house while claiming he was the one being supported by you. The officer explained that my children had constructed a completely false narrative where they were the generous ones taking care of their elderly father, when the reality was the exact opposite. I had been supporting them by paying all the major expenses they couldn't afford on their own. Without my pension money covering the property taxes and utilities and repairs, they probably wouldn't be able to live in this house at all. But they'd convinced themselves they were doing me a favor by letting me stay here. They'd told themselves I was a burden who contributed nothing, and based on that false belief they'd committed elder abuse by throwing me out. My youngest son tried to defend their actions by saying they genuinely didn't know I owned the house and thought it had become family property when Mom died. The officer cut him off and said, ignorance doesn't excuse what you did. You forcibly removed an 81-year-old man from his home. You locked him out in the cold. You blocked his phone number so he couldn't contact you. You left him sitting on a curb for hours with nowhere to go. Those actions constitute elder abuse regardless of who owns the property. The fact that he owns it and you don't just makes it worse because you also committed illegal eviction. The officer then addressed the lie about arranging a care facility to pick me up. He said they'd checked and there was no facility that had any record of me being admitted or any pickup scheduled. My children had made that up to make themselves feel better about abandoning me on the street. They'd told me someone was coming to get me, knowing full well nobody was coming. They'd left me to freeze or wander the streets or worse. My daughter started crying, saying they'd made a terrible mistake and didn't understand what they were doing. But her tears didn't move the officers at all. The lead officer said very clearly that what happened here tonight was criminal, that my children had abused their elderly father and stolen his home from him through deception and force, that they could all be arrested and prosecuted, that they could go to jail and lose their own children to protective services while they were incarcerated. The room went completely silent as the weight of those words sank in. My children looked terrified, realizing the consequences of what they'd done. With the police standing in my living room as witnesses to everything that was being said, I made my own announcement that I'd been thinking about during the entire drive back to the house. I looked at my 3 children and their spouses sitting there on my furniture in my house and said in a clear, steady voice that they had exactly 48 hours to vacate my property. All of them. Every single person who'd participated in throwing me out needed to pack their belongings and find somewhere else to live. I was the legal owner of this house, and I was exercising my right to evict them for elder abuse and fraud and illegal eviction of the actual property owner. My children immediately started protesting and talking over each other, trying to argue against what I was saying. My oldest son said this was their home, and they'd lived here for years, and I couldn't just kick them out. My daughter said they had children to think about and nowhere to go on such short notice. My youngest son said they didn't know I owned the house, and it wasn't fair to punish them for an honest mistake. Their spouses joined in with their own complaints about how unreasonable I was being and how this would traumatize their children and destroy their lives. But I cut through all their protests and excuses with one simple statement. I reminded them that just hours earlier they'd given me 2 hours to pack my entire life into one suitcase and threw me out on the curb in the cold. I reminded them they'd blocked my number, so I couldn't even call for help. I reminded them they'd lied about a care facility coming to pick me up and left me to freeze or die on the street. I reminded them my daughter had told me I didn't contribute anything financially while living rent-free in my house and spending my money. They'd shown me exactly how much they valued family and mercy and second chances when they locked their 81-year-old father out of his own home. My oldest son tried a different approach and started apologizing, saying they'd made a terrible mistake and didn't understand the situation. He said if they'd known I owned the house, they never would have asked me to leave. He begged me to give them another chance and let them stay, and they'd make it right. My daughter joined in with her apologies, saying she was so sorry for everything, and could we please just forget this happened and move forward as a family. My youngest son actually got down on his knees and begged me not to throw them out because his kids needed stability, and this was the only home they'd ever known. But I remembered sitting on that curb watching the sun go down and feeling the cold seep into my bones while my grandchildren played inside the house with the lights on. I remembered calling my children's phones and getting blocked. I remembered the humiliation of neighbors walking past me without offering help. I remembered wandering 6 blocks in the dark with nowhere to go, thinking I might actually die on the street. My children hadn't cared about any of that when they were throwing me out. They hadn't worried about where I would go or whether I'd be safe. They'd just wanted me gone so they could have more space and not deal with an elderly parent anymore. The police officers stood there silently letting me handle this situation however I chose. One of them had mentioned earlier that I could press criminal charges if I wanted to, and my children could face jail time. But I told the officers I didn't want to pursue criminal charges as long as my children vacated the property peacefully within 48 hours. The officer nodded and said that was generous of me considering what they'd done. He said he'd file a report documenting everything, and if my children didn't leave voluntarily within the time frame, I specified the police would come back and remove them by force. I told my children one final time that they had 48 hours starting right now at 11 p.m. By 11 p.m., 2 days from now, they needed to be completely out of my house with all their belongings. If they weren't gone, I would call the police and have them arrested for trespassing. There would be no extensions and no negotiations. My 3 children and their families moved out in complete shock and shame within the court-ordered 48 hours, scrambling desperately to find housing they could actually afford without living rent-free off their father. I watched from my window as they loaded moving trucks with furniture and boxes, looking exhausted and defeated. None of them tried to talk to me or apologize again after that night with the police. They just packed their things and left like I'd asked them to. Their spouses looked angry and resentful, shooting me dirty looks whenever they thought I wasn't watching. The grandchildren looked confused and sad, not understanding why they had to leave their home so suddenly. But nobody explained to them that their parents had thrown their grandfather out on the street first. The police had recommended that I press criminal charges against all three of my children for elder abuse and illegal eviction, but I declined to pursue that route. I told the officers I didn't want my children to go to jail or have criminal records that would follow them for the rest of their lives. I just wanted them out of my house and out of my life after what they'd done to me. However, I did file restraining orders against all three of them and their spouses, keeping them away from my property. The restraining orders were granted immediately by a judge who read the police report and was appalled by what had happened. My children were legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of my house or contacting me in any way. The story of what happened spread through our community like wildfire over the following days and weeks. Neighbors who'd walked past me on that curb suddenly felt guilty and started leaving apology notes in my mailbox saying they wished they'd helped me that night. Mrs. Chen, who'd called the police, became something of a local hero for saving me from freezing on the street. The story got picked up by local news outlets, who ran articles about the elderly man whose children threw him out of his own house, not knowing he was the owner. My children became pariahs in the neighborhood, with people crossing the street to avoid talking to them and whispering behind their backs about what terrible people they were. I heard through mutual acquaintances that my children were struggling badly in their new living situations. My oldest son and his family had to move into a small apartment in a less desirable part of town because that's all they could afford without my financial support. My daughter and her husband were living with her in-laws in a cramped house where everyone was miserable and fighting constantly. My youngest son had to move 2 hours away to find affordable housing, and his kids had to change schools mid-year. None of them could afford the lifestyle they'd been living in my house on my dime. They were finally experiencing real financial pressure and learning what it meant to actually support themselves without their father subsidizing everything. I live alone now in the house I bought 40 years ago, and honestly, I've never felt more peaceful or content. The house is quiet, without children running around and adults arguing about parenting decisions. I can watch whatever I want on television at whatever volume I choose. I can use the bathroom in the morning without anyone complaining. I can keep the heat at a comfortable temperature without anyone saying it's too expensive. I maintain the property myself with help from hired contractors when needed. I pay all the bills from my pension, just like I always did, except now, I'm not also supporting 3 families who were too entitled to appreciate what I was doing for them. The shock on my children's faces when they learned the truth about who owned the house and who was really supporting whom was almost worth the 3 hours I spent freezing on that curb. Almost, but not quite. What they did to me that day destroyed our relationship permanently and completely. They threw out their father, thinking he was a burden, who contributed nothing. The police discovered they'd thrown out their landlord and their benefactor and the person who'd been paying for their comfortable lifestyle all along. They thought they were getting rid of dead weight. They were actually getting rid of the foundation their entire lives were built on. Now they know better, and I hope that lesson haunts them every single day for the rest of their lives.